I'm very proud to be here, to be invited, and I thank the organizers very much for inviting me to come to this conference. I hope that during my speech I can convince you that this mathematical equation 1 + 1 makes 3 is correct if we consider human relationships. As most of you know, cooperation in psychotherapy is, as countless research findings confirm, the all-important factor. Surprisingly, however, cooperation is usually spelled in very functional terms, as if epistemology were all that mattered, not affiliation. At the end of my contribution here, it will hopefully become clearer that talking about cooperation shortens the therapeutic activity. It will be more correct to talk about the organization of cooperation. Cooperation is something that can be seen, while organization is a higher level, a supramodal concept, similar to the Gestalt concepts. Let me give you an example. You all know the experience that you hear a melody and recognize a song. Then you hear the same song when in a completely different key, and still you recognize that it is the same melodic gestalt or shape. All the notes have changed. The melody can be played or sung slower or faster, but you hear it as the same melody, the same organization. You all know solo sonatas by Johann Sebastian Bach or other musicians. They are played by only one instrument. Think of Aurel Nicolet playing the flute. And suddenly, although only one tone can be played, you hear a second melody in it. But if the melody is played enough, you hear this second melody built into the musical form. The melody grows beyond itself, as it were. Nothing is added, but we have something more. Another example for Gestalt organization from our everyday work in the treatment room. Recently, I listened behind the one-way screen to a psychiatrist exploring a 35-year-old female patient. He asked her questions. She answered. She told how her parents gave her a lot of rules. The interviewer then asked her why she did not work in her profession. She answered that her husband did not allow her to do. Then the interviewer asked her, "How old are you?" And at first, this sounded like a continuation of exploratory questions. She gave her age and was startled for this question. Suddenly had a completely different meaning. A second melody emerged because the responding with her age made it clear that she behaved to her husband as if she had completely to obey. The interviewer himself had not recognized how skillfully he had posed his question. He was entitled to continue his exploration, but he did not intend for his question to take on a whole new meaning. It was not an intervention. It was the creation of an addendum. It all depends on your ability to hear this something more. So my thesis here is that in psychotherapy, we do not only strive for cooperation in order to change people. We try to connect so that the therapeutic couple 1 + 1 has the chance to creatively produce a surplus. Here is my little mathematics of a therapeutic couple's relationship. We have couples which follow the equation of 1 + 1 makes 0. Everyone feels less of worth, of activity, of initiative if connected to the other person. Or you have the couple with the equation 1 + 1 makes 1. One dominates, the other partner is silenced. You have it when both partners have equal rights and obligations, but the risk of rivalry then is very strong. And sometimes you have the equation 1 + 1 makes 3. Both achieve a state of higher level, and they define their individual states as dependent from achieving the higher level. Each one is an element of the whole. While these little mathematics of a couple's relationship, I do not want to propose a typology of couples which would endure over long periods of time. No. This, what I gave you, is a description of temporary states that can occur in any therapeutic couple. To achieve change, the therapeutic couple must be able to connect, sometimes very deeply. It must also be possible to give up this bond again so that new states of higher connectedness can be sought. Edward Tronick, prominent infant researcher from Boston, speaks here of the dyadic state of consciousness. This consideration has also inspired other authors, and they have found somewhat similar terms for it. Let me shortly remind you of some well-known phrases produced by social scientists. Harvey Sachs, founder of conversation analysis, was convinced that in every conversation a silent dimension accompanies talk. He named this dimension as "my mind is with you." And this starts by realizing doing together to do together. If you realize this, the emotional component is joy. Children enjoy very much doing together to do together. If this is practiced during some time length, people realize that they are thinking about thinking people. This is more than Irving Goffman's formula of mutual monitoring, which addressed perceiving being perceived. We observe each other while talking in many ways with different degrees of sensibilities. But we do that, if only because otherwise we could never get to speak ourselves if we did not observe when the other person would also listen to us. So, participatory sense-making is a universal dimension of human interaction. And in order to understand this process, I want to introduce to you a new term. I assume you have seldomly heard that the term is recursion. Recursion has been defined by Wilhelm von Humboldt, and it means achieving infinity with finite means. Here is the answer in the dictionary. Recursion, see recursion, see recursion. Do it again and again and again. Our alphabet fulfills this prerequisite. With a few letters, you can build the Library of Babylon. You can think thinking. And if you succeed, you think the thinking of thinking, and you are already on a higher and a higher and the highest levels, which in turn can be thought. Recursion is inevitable and increases to a cascade of evolving systems in a similar way, as an extended line can be extended by further extended lines. An extended line can be extended by further extended lines to a triangle, and by adding further lines from the triangle, the discovery comes that this can also be directed vertically. This means a pyramid arises. And this is an experience that even small children can have. They like the song, Stone on Stone. Stone on stone, the cottage will be ready soon. You have a line and you add another achieving a triangle, and then you take another line vertically and you have a pyramid. Doing the same again and again, you create infinity. But this is not, as we have been trained to see in psychoanalysis, it is not repetition. It creates new buildings. In fact, you put stone on stone, and eventually you have an habitable theory building. I will show you a short excursion into modern developmental psychology. I'm sure you have heard the name of Michael Tomasello. He's the most prominent infant researcher in an anthropological perspective, because he compared human babies with ape newborns. And he finds what I want to read to you in this wonderful quotation. He writes, importantly, in classic accounts of joint attention, the engagement there is not only triadic. The infant and adult are sharing attention to an external entity or situation. This would form a triad. One person, second person, the situation. But in addition, it has a kind of recursive social structure. The infant is attending not only to the adult's attention to the object, but also to the adult's attention to her attention to the object, and to the adult's attention to her attention to the adult's attention to the object, and so on. It is not that the infant engages in this kind of recursive thinking explicitly, but that the underlying structure of joint attention means that they both know together that they both are attending to the same thing. This means sharing experience. Every communication must be accompanied by a silent dimension of my mind is with you, of sharing experience. With Tomasello, we get this silent dimension spelled out, as it were. Let's see if we can find how this begins in human development. Just imagine you step into a room that looks like this. An immediately moving question is, will you fall into the hole? Or does it just look like that? You do not know. How do you find an answer? By testing your visual sense, by approaching and carefully touching the carpet. It is the same with a baby who sees a round ball in front. Let us imagine that a baby, 2 or 3 months of age, lying in the cradle, sees something like a ball dangling on a thread in front of it. Is it round or is it flat? Is it so close or distant as it seems to be? Is it only a picture on a screen? Seeing it is the first sense here. If the baby has the marvelous idea to grasp it, a second sense, touch, is added. If both senses report the same thing, that the ball actually feels as round as it looks, then it probably really is. Both senses have achieved integration. A bifocal triad has been created for a moment. What does this experience look like the next day when another ball like this dangles in front of the baby? We find an answer when we see the principle of recursion. Everything looks like the first time. Both senses integrate. But now the baby is happy because it already knows this. Memory comes into play. Behind each element of the triad, yesterday's experience is revealed. Today's integration is modeled on that of yesterday. A conclusion is for the baby inevitable. The baby must conclude that it itself was already there yesterday, and that it is itself that has already had this experience of yesterday. For a moment, this experience gives rise to what infant researchers call the proto-self. It arises in the triad of self-reference. From this moment on, the possibility develops more and more to distinguish all action and doing according to a point of view of object reference and self-reference. The same principle holds in the following situation, which you all know quite well. Now, two persons. Let's imagine you have a guest for the first time in your flat whom you don't know yet. It might be the spouse of a work colleague or the like. You shake hands, greet each other, glances go back and forth. And then what happens next? The guest points to something wherever you look, and you are already in a common world of perception. The guest points, you look, and you are in a common world of perception. Now the guest points to the object and says, this beautiful object, this beautiful painting at the wall, fabulous, and points to it. And you look at it too and follow up communicatively. Oh yes, I bought that in the so-and-so gallery. I'm sure you know it too. And both of you are already in a small conversation starter. The pointing gesture is elementary. It's me pointing to something, sometimes to a mental object. Did you hear the so-and-so talk? Then only with words. And the other recognizes it. This is what Goodwin called the use of public signs, but more happens. The interpersonal triad generates a distinction between epistemic and affiliative dimensions. Because while you are talking to each other like this, many glances go back and forth, and you start to feel comfortable with each other. The interpersonal triad stabilizes. Both persons form the possibility of seeing, speaking, and acting binocularly with each other. The object of reference forms the epistemic dimension of knowledge. The self-reference develops into the affiliative dimension of being related. Now, let's turn to another very important question. What happens if the object of pointing is not something in the physical world, like a picture on the wall, but an interaction? If you point to something that the two of you interacted. With this question, I would like to venture into the field known in psychoanalysis as transference analysis. My many years of conversational studies of therapeutic conversations have long taught me that psychoanalysis has discovered something important with terms like transference and resistance. And now I will show you an example of one of the best clinicians, Horst Kerchler, who died last year, we had in Germany. Horst Kerchler was professor of psychotherapy research in Ulm, wrote a 3-volume textbook on psychoanalysis together with Helmut Thome, which has been translated into more than 30 languages. Above all, together with Thome, he built up the so-called Ulmer text bank, which contains a treasure trove of completely audiographed therapeutic analysis. From this I now show you the beginning of the 7th therapy session with a somewhat compulsive student. This session begins like this. You hear the rustling of fabrics. Then the patient, with some small laughter, says, "So it's not you beginning." The patient to the therapist. A little pause. Then the patient inhales in line 4. The therapist calmly says, A pause. Patient, Another pause. Then the therapist, "Is this important for you, or if I would begin?" No, I was just thinking today. I'm not going to say anything today." He has a grin in his voice. To say anything today, at the beginning, he laughs, and look what happens. Therapist, Pause. The patient clears his throat. A pause. Then the therapist comes out. "So it's more kind of a test." "Yeah, really." A little bit, pause, little bit of a wrestling match. Patient, yes. And both fall in a small laughter. A reduction of complexity occurs, which proceeds on 4 preliminary stages and is then secured. The patient points to his own action, not beginning. This is an action. He points to an action. The shared perception is secured conclusively. So, and in so it's not beginning, it's not you beginning, and in mutual ratification. They both certify by their small utterances, that they speak about the same things. They are in a common word. The therapist points to this here, and the second level of common ground, CG, is my abbreviation for common ground. The therapist says, points to this and to you and I, adding an affiliative value, important. And then the patient links, coming to level 3, his own behavior not to begin, to his project, doing an experiment. Look what happens today, and studying the results. Affiliatively, he makes the therapist the object of study. The therapist responds with a new metaphor of a little wrestling match, and the patient laughingly agrees. The patient articulates a paradox. To say not to begin is a meta-pragmatic contradiction. He does what he denies. What if a therapist would point to this paradox? In the affiliative dimension, the patient makes the therapist an object of study. What if the therapist would rebuke and utter, "Not he, the patient is object of study, please"? You see, Horst Kechele invented a very creative other strategy. What makes the therapist create the metaphor of the wrestling match? This is not in the spoken material. It comes from something felt, but in metaphoric words, and thus pointing to a new interactional object. The whole cycle can start again, but on a higher level. Pointing, and then pointing to the metaphor, and pointing to the wrestling match, etc. Yeah. Now, this is my model to be read top down. In the first level, there is a verbal utterance equivalent to a pointing gesture. The common ground level I name perception. An object in the common ground, in the common perceptual world, is addressed. If the recipient confirms the pointing, the perceptual object is transformed into a conversational object. Both speakers can refer to a common object and develop actual knowledge of the other's state of mind and affiliation. a common experience is created. On a third level, two other conversational objects can become possible, which requires sometimes the use of analogical reasoning. On a fourth level, this process of transforming can be made transparent by the creative use of a metaphor for this process itself. The consequence of which is that the metaphorical object thus can be treated in an as-if mode, as if it were a perceptual object shared by the two participants. The process can recur to level 1, producing a spiral of transformation. This recursion could make use of the same steps, but produce higher levels in the spiral. Both participants realize that they are doing together to do together. And in this special case, it comes as a surprise, because the patient did not want to start at all. As the metaphor of the wrestling match articulates their shared experience, they are in a dyadic state of consciousness. And what they are doing is achieving higher levels of interaction and of neutrally observing. In my following example, I will show you how these steps from pointing to a metaphor are done achieving higher levels of interaction and of observing the interaction. This is now about a woman of 20 who in turn finds an imaginative description of the relationship with her therapist, me. She tells in the session that for the first time in her life, she spends a week of holidays with her new friend. But she does not dare to tell this to her mother, with whom she normally shares everything, 2 or 3 telephone calls per day. And she does not dare to tell this to her mother or her sister, who does not have a friend and is much more unhappy than my patient is. It's the 156th psychoanalytic session. I'll read it to you. The patient starts with, and then I said, nope, not for now. And then I thought whether I tell anyone at all, because nobody will notice where I will clear. Anita and Larissa, 2 of her girlfriends, know this, that she plans a travel tour with her friend. They know this, that I'm not at home. And Petra, another girlfriend, knows it too. But nobody really knows where I am. Then I say, I do. I know it too. Yes, you know it too, but I laugh a little bit. Yes, right. You know that. Forget this anyhow sometimes. For me, it's so natural that you know that as if I incorporated this, as if you were my second hand. This is a wonderful metaphor. My second hand, although this would be beautiful, then I would think more. Or as if I have 4 ears, so to speak. Then I come and say, which is a beautiful metaphor. 4 ears? Yes, and we both are laughing softly. Yeah. Well, then there are ears which would listen to your own listening again. Yeah. Can I put it that way? Yeah. So, and then I also thought about, and the mouth quasi an auxiliary mouth, a helping mouth. Yeah. Then the patient, so I would understand that, the auxiliary mouth. That's me. Of course. We can see precisely how on level 1 the patient creates a creation for our relationship, which is 1 + 1 is 1. She ignores me and knowledge of her activities. This ignorance is given up when she shouts yes and agrees on level 2. The equation changes to 1 + 1 is 2. We both become present, and she can reflect on her ignoring me by her remark that she sometimes forgets my presence. On level 3, she can link this perception of ignoring me with her experience that I am present. And this link is very fastly combined to a new, never heard metaphor of the four ears, an equation of 1 + 1 is 3 is created. And how recursion goes on. And now recursion goes on. I comment on this as a beautiful metaphor. She looks, she laughs, and I, saying these ears, make a verbal pointing gesture. I point to 4 ears and a double head which nobody has ever seen, but which is an object in our talk. I point to these ears, and the process starts on level 1 again, but in a higher state of organization. Here is how it continues. Yes, I believe, because I do not perceive you in that sense as an individual human being, which you are, of course, but always within this framework of analysis here and also in this room, I think. And I do not even have to say so when I, for example, anyhow, if I have said to Petra, her girlfriend, or I have sometimes Petra told things I say then which even Mama does not know, does nobody know. And I have told her, and there she said, yes, and Mr. Buchholz knows it. And then yes, of course. She's always quoting herself. So this is, I don't mention this anymore because for me it's clear that you know. At least that what I say and tell here. And there's still maybe one or the other thing you do not tell then, if it became hearable. Yeah. Then if it became hearable, then by my auxiliary mouth, it would again become hearable to your ears. Yes, probably I should talk out exactly the things I do not say here. That the patient really means the organization of our relationship becomes clear in the first formulation of this section. That I am not perceived by her as a single person at all. And this organizational particularity of a therapeutic psychoanalytic relationship is formulated by her here very precisely as a difference from everyday conversational formats. Traditional psychoanalysts would speak here of the processing of resistance, namely that she does not tell everything, but one can clearly see which interactive organization happens in the process. She takes a higher, a more developed, eccentric position towards herself. It happens that the theorist of psychoanalysis, Otto Fenichel, had already spoken in 1945 of the analyst being an auxiliary ego for his patients. But this patient finds an analogous formulation that actually aims even more precisely at the conversational aspect of the therapeutic situation by clearly incorporating corporeality, head, mouth, ear, into her imaginative formulations. I will now show a failure of this process of recursively stepping to higher levels. My question is, what if a conversation is not enriched imaginatively? When I ask this question, I want to prepare you right away for the fact that we can observe that this has embodied consequences. You see, organization of cooperation uses resources, embodied resources. Your body, face, gaze, postures, movements, the other person's body, your voice, intonation, your attention and your ways to attract the other's attention, rhythm and flow of the interaction, institutionalized norms, rules, roles, the end of the cooperation. How do you know? The cultural and material world around you, and finally recursion to find the same gestalt. This is a list of what is included in the organization of doing we. All these resources cannot be aligned in a simple way. Intersubjectivity is not a match or a simple entrainment. Conversational analysis, especially the work by Charles Goodwin, could show that we handle a bunch of ecological and embodied processes, including different intentions, and that we balance these elements very carefully in order to achieve in an act of mutual sense-making. These processes of balancing and integrating resources results in the distinction between higher order and lower order alignment, which is best understood to be a gestalt. I want to show you now how this can be described. Let's take a look at the conditions when a patient is telling something. You have a teller and the recipient. On the lower line here, I have drawn in the report format, where everything is added simply to show it is the same. No tension, every element the same. Sequentiality is achieved by adding same elements. In our languages, you can very often hear, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then I went to the ice cream, and then I went to my school, and then. Something is reported. This is very different when something is told. So we have to distinguish report and narration by showing that there is an increasing tension achieved by certain means of dramatization. And the Finnish authors, which detected these things, they measured heart rate and psychogalvanic skin response, the change of electric conductivity on the fingers due to sweating as a measure of arousal. Now, these measures, while a teller and a listener interact in a narration, show something very interesting. And this can be felt phenomenologically if you listen to a teller or if you realize what's going on when you tell something yourself. In narration, we usually start with a little pre-announcement. Shall I tell you what happened to me yesterday? This negotiates the consent of the listener, communicates on an expectation of the emotional reactions. Then the second phase is setting the stage. I went on the so-and-so street, and second stage, I met my boss. And then we are off to the climax of the story. This climb is accompanied by many continuers of the recipient, tell me, from the listener. When a maximum of tension has been reached, there must come a change of state token. This is my abbreviation, COST. Something like, really? Did this really happen? Was it yesterday? Or something like that, by which the recipient informs the teller that the recipient's state of information, of attentivity has changed. This sign is very important. The listener must take stance. Affiliation then occurs. The speaker's heart rate and psychogalvanic skin reaction increase with the narration to the climax. But when the change of state token follows, the speaker's tension drops abruptly and that of the listener increases, surprisingly. And the further observation is, without affiliative reaction, narrators repeat their story. Lecturers repeat if they do not get a response from the audience. Interviewers answer 2 or 3 times the same question, and so do patients on the couch. Here is the origin where this has been written and published, this study by Pericule. And as you can see, they found a very attractive title. It's the title, Sharing the Emotional Load. Recipient affiliation calms down the storyteller. Sharing the emotional load. This is, so to speak, now a well-confirmed thing. We know this as metaphorical expression for our therapeutic endeavor, that we share the emotional load of our patients. But this can be shown now, several other studies followed. This can be shown now to have a physiological base. What I want to show you now is sorry. Okay. What I want to show you now is a situation where the therapist is not ready to show the emotion, to share the emotional load. The patient tells of humiliating punitive actions at school. I'll read that to you. The patient says, a young woman of 24 or 25 years, in her 3rd interview session, she says, in the boarding school, in the Catholic boarding school where she lived in her days when she was 16, that was quite extreme with us. If you made any statements once or twice that didn't suit the teachers, then you got the stamp that you were a ricochet or whatever. And then they treated you accordingly. There were girls among us who were expelled from school or things. That was unbelievable. And here's a pause. And this pause means this is a point where the patient wants to hear a change of state token. It was unbelievable. You hear the telling of the story, you hear how the tension increases, and you hear her evaluation. That was unbelievable. And if the therapist does not respond, this response is an information for the patient. Now she repeats. So it was only because of little remarks or because they did something or other. And so in part it was just too conservative for me. Only in the upper school where I slowly became aware of it, where you think more about such things, then I didn't want to change anymore. Well, it starts with things like skirts. Yes, we had to give them away. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been allowed to wear them. And short-sleeve bodysuits were forbidden in summer and all that kind of thing. They sent you home when you came to school like that. You weren't allowed to do that. And here the therapist comes in with an and asks, has this happened to you? And he hears, what? An angry shouted what? Which forces him to repeat and to explain his question. Well, that you were sent home because no, I more or less kept it. I didn't necessarily want to. I mean, I'm not necessarily the type who has to go to school in a short skirt or whatever. The patient tells all these things I had explained to you, and here she makes what is called in conversation analysis a list of the same type of things or events, And here, all that kind of things is the so-called general list completer, when you show that you end the list of what you want to tell. But the question of the therapist is intrusive and does not follow the line of telling of the patient. And you see in the patient's response that the patient does not accept this question. What? She understood it very well. The question is articulated very clear. Yeah. What? And he does not mean the content of the question, but posing the question at this position, because this position is in trouble, because the change of state tokens have been omitted by the therapist before. So, to give you an expression how these two talk together, I want to give you a short impression, half a minute. Yeah.
Duyamıyoruz.
Can you hear that?
Mihal, we could not.
Yeah?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah, we will ask the technical desk to.
No. It's my problem. Sorry.
All right. Okay.
Right. Give me a second, please. I will.
Sure.
I will come in with that. I have to. Yeah, I have to. So. So before, can you hear that now?
Yes.
Yes. We have invented a certain technique. We made an electronic dot on the nose of both speakers, on the video, not in real life, on the video, and we followed the movements of the heads to left and right and up and down of both. And you can see here how animated the patient speaks, how excited she is, and aroused, and the therapist very calm, very strong.
Ganz extrem, und wenn du da ein, zweimal irgendwelche Äußerungen gegen Ethik hast, die den Lerner nicht in den Kram gepasst haben, dann hast du den Stempel aufgedruckt gehabt, dass du da irgendwie ein Querschläger bist oder wie auch immer, und dann haben sie die auch dementsprechend behandelt. Also es sind bei uns auch Mädels wegen Sachen von der Schule geflogen, das war einfach unglaublich. Also nur wegen kleineren Bemerkungen oder weil sie halt irgendwas getan haben oder so. Und das, also zum Teil war es mir dann einfach zu konservativ, nur in der Oberstufe, wo mir das halt dann langsam bewusst worden ist, wo man da mehr über solche Sachen nachdenkt, da wollte ich halt dann auch nicht mehr wechseln. Und nur, ich meine, das fängt an bei den Sachen, dass bei uns Röcke, ja, die haben bis daher müssen, sonst hast du sie gar nicht anziehen dürfen, und kurzärmelige Leiberinnen waren im Sommer verboten und all solche Sachen. Die haben die Hand geschickt, wenn du in die Schule gekommen bist, also das hast du nicht dürfen.
Kam das bei Ihnen vor?
Was?
Oder dass Sie handgeschickt haben?
Nein, ich habe mich da schon mehr oder weniger dran gehalten, ich wollte jetzt nicht unbedingt, ich meine, ich bin jetzt auch nicht unbedingt der Typ, der mit so einem kurzen Rock und was in die Schule gehen muss.
If you read these, the patient's head movement and the therapist's head movement, you can clearly see the enormous difference in agility and in movement, and you see how the patient moves her eyebrows when she says, "This was unbelievable, unbelievable," in order to give a strong emotional accent on it. There are definitely strong elements of self-reflection in this narration. We found 13 episodes of this kind, questions and denying the answers, in the first 14 minutes of this session. No therapeutic stance taking, instead the therapist posing questions to which the patient responded with disqualifying the type of question, the deontic right to pose the question, the moment of the question, etc. This episode ends when the therapist remarks that the patient has now told many stories, but has not yet shared anything about her inner experience. The patient now looks at the floor in front of her, then briefly looks at the therapist as if she wanted to know what he meant. The therapist does not respond to her gaze. She looks at the floor again, and with just a spirited expression is brought to a full stop. They both remain silent for 1 minute and a half in a third interval. This is the episode. You hear nothing because there is nothing to hear. Both are silent. The therapist posed the question, what about your inner experience, dear patient? And then the patient looks to the floor. Nothing happens. Then she looks to the therapist, and the therapist does not respond. She's looking to the floor, now to the therapist, asking this gaze meaning what's going on here. So, and here we have measured. You see my spot on my shirt, and you see this spot on the video too with the patient and the therapist, and you can measure the inhalation and exhalation of both. Here is a curve how they inhalate and exhalate, and red is the breathing of the therapist, green the patient. This graph makes the tension in breathing visible. The conversation comes to a halt. Both are silent, their breathing moves in sync. One can see the wavy lines here, which strongly resemble a sinus curve, until a syncope becomes visible here at this point. Up to this point, the patient's breathing rhythm, the red line seems to follow that of her therapist, but then the rhythm stumbles briefly. The therapist's inhalation crosses the patient's exhalation. Something changes, and this is exactly the point where the patient looks at the therapist. So, I come to some conclusions. General conclusions are: patients and therapists monitor each other mutually. Patients share their experiences which they present by narration. Sharing experience can be delivered by a change of state token or by stance taking. And as related to questions and answers, the way how therapists pose questions informs the patient about the therapist's participation. The immediate response to the question informs the therapist of the appropriateness, relevance, timing, and justification of the question. One's own physical discomfort can inform therapists if there is a disturbance. Both parties in a therapeutic encounter are vulnerable, but therapists can be expected to have courage to admit failure, having posed the wrong question or failed otherwise. Therapists then could learn how non-vulnerable, how strong patients sometimes are. They forgive if therapists admit. All these conclusions have been expressed in the quote here by Bateman and Fonagy. The patient has to find himself or herself in the mind of the clinician, and equally, the clinician has to understand him and herself in the mind of the patient. Both have to experience a mind being changed by a mind. The result of this equation is 3. Thank you for your attention.